On July 16th, 1945, humanity reached a new age, the Atomic Age. Just as one war was wrapping up, a new one began, a battle of ideologies between capitalism and communism. If this was in any other time in history, the story would have followed the same path as any rivalry between empires. Tension, escalation, and finally, a war, until there was a clear victor to take the spoils. But this war never happened. With nuclear weapons, we have the capacity to make ourselves extinct. So that brings up a question: what if the nuclear bomb was never invented? Let's imagine a scenario, theorize, that for some reason humanity just never discovers nuclear energy. Say, starting in an alternate 1945, there is no Manhattan Project, no ability to create nuclear fission. Maybe the Soviets even go back in time and kill Einstein, so the nuke is never created. Oh god, we went too far. I already did a video about this, so I'll make it quick. There's this classic question when it comes to Japan in World War II. Did America really need to drop the nukes on Japan? To me, honestly, in the scale of death and destruction, there really wasn't a big difference between nuking a city and firebombing it, except perhaps the number of bombs. Without the nuke, America's original plan for Japan was a full-scale invasion. It probably would never have came to that. Japan most likely would have surrendered around the same time, even without the nukes. Why? The Soviets. Even though the Soviets and Japanese were technically enemies in the war, neither nation really wanted to get involved in another front, so they never declared war on one another. Let's just say they had more pressing matters. But once the Soviets were done with the Germans, they turned their attention onto Japan. Japan feared the communists far more than the Americans, and knew if they surrendered to the US, their way of life would at least be preserved. And they were right. Even though two cities were nuked, what was core to the empire, the emperor himself, was allowed to continue to rule. Hell, even most of their war criminals weren't punished. Thanks, America. The threat of a nuclear apocalypse forced the two rival world powers to change how they spread their own influence. Direct fighting was off the table, and since it was, the way to win in this new world was through smaller means, covert means, influencing elections, propping up allies, or even in some cases, fighting for them on their behalf. Colonialism had taken a new face, and it was through the lens of ideology. Containment became the policy of the United States after Korea. Don't try to directly attack where the Soviets already control, because that would lead to just nuclear war. Instead, contain it from spreading out. Vietnam was such a giant disaster not because the United States couldn't fight a bunch of farmers, but because the US was trying to contain communism from spreading across borders that weren't even a decade old. America could never send troops directly into North Vietnam because then China would get involved, or Russia retaliates in Germany. Bombing the North was the best they could do because it didn't change the lines on the map. And in the end, it wasn't enough. It'd be like if we fought the war on terror but never actually went after the true ones behind the whole jihadist mentality. Oh wait. Mutually assured destruction created rules that everybody had to play by. Remove the nukes, you remove the rules. All you're left with is two of the world's biggest powers who hate each other, and their most recent war ended in a victory. How do you think this will end? World War III wouldn't be a conflict that ends humanity, but it'd certainly be one that injures it beyond measure. A final climax to a trilogy in the making. The victor left to decide what the fate of the world is, at least for a while. That's the next question. Who wins? The further along we get in the Cold War, the less effective the Red Army and Warsaw Pact are as a whole. So I'm going to keep the time frame of when this war takes place as general as possible, because really, even with that in mind, at any time period, it'd probably still be the same result. Let's set the stage. It is 19XX, and tensions have been boiling for years. Interference by the United States in some small country was the tipping point for the Soviets. Mobilization has been happening for weeks, and the Western powers prepare themselves as well. Instead of a scene where both sides would panic and hope that things don't escalate, for many, they might forget the horrors of conventional war and remember only the victory, especially for Americans who are far from any actual danger considering their geographic position, but I'll talk about that later. Europeans protest the escalation on both sides, considering their home will become the showdown. These are crushed in the USSR, but in the West, many warhawks call those that protest the war cowards because they don't wish to defend their own land against the Reds. Oh boy. Day 1. Reports come in of tanks moving into West Berlin. The city falls in hours. The Red Army begins its steamroll across Western Europe, using its numerical advantage. News cameras report live as the Third World War begins. A conventional war for the USSR is actually very risky. Yes, they have the manpower, but they are outclassed by the West when it comes to naval and air power, logistics, and supplies. Which seems insane. This was the power that steamrolled the Nazis, but you have to think the Russians were only able to steamroll because they had the numbers to take it. Many of those numbers were supplied through American industry. With the Americans being on the enemy side this time though, the Russians don't have the industry to outcompete the United States. They can take more bloodshed than NATO, but they can't supply their own troops as much as NATO. I don't want to sound like some American fanboy because I'm not. What I'm saying is that the United States has many advantages. They in this war are the ones that simply have to outlast the Soviets, not the other way around. For NATO, this war really is about the long game. Stop any initial gains by the Red Army, no matter how much, and keep them there. Unlike Napoleon and Hitler, NATO has geography on their side. The Americans are separated from the rest of the world by two large oceans. World War III simply never would come to the US. Battles would be waged in Europe and Asia. However, no Red Army boots could ever set foot on American soil. Even at the height of their power, the USSR never had the naval or air capabilities to rival Britain and the US. Throughout its life, the Soviets only had 9 aircraft carriers. By the end of the 60s, the US had 67. The air and sea is where NATO would want to fight the war, maintain the economic and logistical power of the West, resupply their troops using their massive industry, and simply wait for the Soviets to buckle. You can never win a land war in Asia, so simply don't fight one. There is no direct invasion of Russia during this world war. History has shown that if wars don't produce good results, ideologies begin to crack. The Soviets' best advantage could easily become their greatest weakness. The Warsaw Pact was created by the Soviets as they invaded on the way to take down the Nazis. The governments they installed were really nothing but puppets. Soviet-style communism was about maintaining Russian supremacy, a barrier against the West. This is their greatest advantage, but in a conventional war, it could be their greatest foil. If the war becomes unpopular enough, or say a little CIA trickery happens, dissent could ferment within the Warsaw Pact nations. Even then, it's a risky bet. This type of dissent might take years to happen. And it also has to be big enough that the Soviets focus attention away from the front lines. I don't think the Red Army would be able to take much more land outside their initial gains. Think of it a lot like Japan in World War II. They had a massive military, made impressive gains, but overall were beaten because their enemy could produce more than them and replace any supplies they lost. In war, economies mean everything. Soviet industry would be facing an uphill battle, having to compete with the largest economy in the world, while also producing at a rate that keeps their own military well supplied. It's something I simply don't think they'd win. World War III, if it did end, wouldn't involve troops entering Moscow. It would end with the Soviet Union collapsing under itself. Perhaps this would be more peaceful, much like in the 90s, or result in a civil war just like the one that gave rise to the Soviets in the first place. Either way, the USSR simply wouldn't survive, even if they did have the manpower. World War III would have been a world war, even if I didn't make it seem like it. Really, for a video this long, there's many things that I can't mention, but just trust me, it really would be a conflict spanning the globe. The 20th century really is just a century of these massive conflicts. Even after, there is no peace. At least not one that we saw after World War II. We are in the longest period of peace ever in human history. The top nations of the world haven't fought one another since World War II. And I truly believe this only happened because of nuclear weapons. Nukes forced everyone to become rational actors, to not go too far because you destroy yourself. And while there is always the threat that we easily could, we haven't. And they kept the two greatest rivals in modern history from killing one another just because of that self-preservation. That period before economies become globally linked would be marred by large-scale warfare, not small internal conflicts or proxy wars. I'm not saying nukes are good or bad, it's a question that only time will tell. Nukes made large-scale war have no benefit, made it have no victor. They're the gun to our head to make sure we all play nice. Whether that's a positive or negative depends on if we pull the trigger. This is Cody of Alternate History Hub.